The air in Bellevue was different in 2025. It smelled of money and wet pine, a clean, sterile scent that clung to everything. At the funeral of Richard Davenport, the air was also thick with something else, a cold, corporate silence. It wasn't the hush of grief. It was the quiet of a boardroom waiting for the quarterly results. Men in sharp, dark suits, whose net worth could be measured in IPOs, stood with the rigid posture of those unaccustomed to stillness. Women with faces as smooth and unlined as their smartphone screens murmured condolences that sounded like business propositions. They were all there, the titans of the tech world, paying their respects not to a man, but to a market cap. And through them all moved Elizabeth Davenport, his wife of 20 years, a ghost at her own husband's funeral. At 70, she should have looked frail, a grieving widow lost in the sea of power brokers. But she wasn't. Her back was straight. Her eyes were dry. She stood at the graveside, a small, still figure in a simple black dress, watching the impossibly expensive casket being lowered into the damp earth. There was no tremor in her hands, no crack in her composure. This stillness, this lack of performative sorrow, was a deep and profound irritation to her stepchildren, who stood beside her like monuments to resentment. Jacob, at 45, was a scaled-down, less charismatic version of his father. He had Richard's ambition, but none of his genius, a fact that had haunted every day of his adult life. He stood stiffly, his jaw tight, checking the time on his watch as if the burial were running over schedule. His sister, Chloe, 42, was a masterpiece of curated grief. She dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, her expression a careful study of sorrow she had likely practiced in the mirror. Every few moments, her thumb would betray her, swiping at the screen of the phone hidden in her palm, scanning the social media tributes pouring in for her father, her face lit by its pale, narcissistic glow. They both glanced at Elizabeth, their shared annoyance, a silent, bitter conversation. Her composure wasn't dignified. To them, it was defiant. It was the silence of an employee, not a wife. Later, back at the sprawling glass and steel mansion overlooking Lake Washington, the wake felt less like a memorial and more like a networking event. The low hum of conversation was about funding rounds and server capacity, not fond memories. And Elizabeth, the lady of the house, moved through the crowd like a phantom. She carried a silver tray, her movements economical and quiet. She refilled a glass of champagne for a venture capitalist who didn't even look at her. She picked up a discarded napkin from a polished concrete floor. She offered canapés to a group of software engineers who parted around her as if she were furniture. She was invisible, a functional object in the grand, cold machine of the Davenport legacy. This was the role she had played for 2 decades, and she played it to perfection. It was in the kitchena, vast, stainless steel cavern designed for a professional catering team, not a family that the fragile peace finally shattered. The room was momentarily empty, a stark, silent space away from the drone of the wake. Elizabeth was rinsing a few glasses in the industrial-sized sink, the water running over her pale, elegant hands. Jacob and Chloe entered behind her, their footsteps loud and purposeful on the tiled floor. They didn't come to help. They came to close a deal. Elizabeth. Jacob's voice was devoid of warmth, the same tone he used to address his subordinates. We need to talk about the future. Elizabeth turned off the tap, the sudden silence amplifying the tension in the room. She turned to face them, her expression calm, patient, waiting. Chloe leaned against a steel countertop, her phone finally out in the open. She was scrolling through her own Instagram feed, a curated gallery of photos of her and her father. "Dad would have wanted us to be practical," she said, her eyes still on the screen. "He wasn't a sentimental man. It was always about the next step, the smart move." Exactly, Jacob said, stepping closer. This house, it's a lot. The upkeep, the taxes, the staff. It's an enterprise, not a home. It's too much for you. To be blunt, Elizabeth remained silent, her hands resting on the edge of the sink behind her. She just watched them, her gaze steady. Her silence seemed to unnerve Jacob. He cleared his throat, adjusting the knot of his tie. We've looked into some options, he continued, forcing a note of magnanimity into his voice. There's a community, the Pines, over in Medina. It's top tier, the best. It's more like a resort, really. They have water aerobics. A book club. You'd be comfortable. The word hung in the air. Comfortable. A neat, tidy box for her to live out her remaining years. Out of sight, out of the way. Chloe finally looked up from her phone, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. Think of it, Elizabeth. No more responsibilities, we would handle everything. The estate, the company, everything Dad built. It's what he would have expected. Her gaze swept over Elizabeth's simple black dress, the serving tray still on a nearby counter. It's time for you to rest. The silence stretched. Elizabeth's stillness was a void they couldn't comprehend. They expected tears, or pleas, or a grateful, quavering acceptance. They got nothing. They got a blank wall, and it infuriated them. Jacob's manufactured patience began to fray. Chloe's mask of detached practicality slipped. Chloe sighed, a theatrical, exasperated sound. She turned to Jacob, but she pitched her voice just loud enough to be a whip crack in the silent kitchen, a deliberate, targeted strike. Honestly, Jacob, she whispered, the sound slick with venom. What does the Maid need with a 15,000 square foot house anyway? The word landed. Maid. Not a slip of the tongue. It was a weapon sharpened over 20 years of slights, of being ignored, of being treated as less. It was the distillation of 2 decades of humiliation into a single perfect syllable. For the first time, something in Elizabeth shifted. It was almost imperceptible. Her hand, resting on the cold steel of the sink, trembled. Just once. A tiny tremor, a seismic shock running through a fault line that had been dormant for years. The heat of it, a sudden, molten rage, rose from her gut into her chest. It wasn't a hot, messy anger. It was cold. It was clarifying. It was the precise, silent click of a lock snapping into place. The years of practiced passivity, of enduring smiles and quiet compliance, fell away in that single, silent moment. The ghost they thought they were speaking to vanished, and in her place, something else began to coalesce. Something they had never seen. Something they could never have imagined. The decision was made. The war had begun. The memory hit her later, as she walked through the echoing halls of the house. It wasn't a gentle wave of nostalgia. It was a shard of glass in her mind, sharp and sudden. 2005. 20 years ago. The house had been different then. It had been Richard's, yes, but it hadn't yet been colonized by Chloe's taste. There were still pockets of warmth, corners that held the potential for a life. Elizabeth, then 50, newly married, had believed in that potential. She had believed Richard's promises of a partnership, a new beginning. The flashback was vivid. A party, one of the first they'd hosted. She'd worn a cream-coloured dress. She'd bought a beautiful, hand-woven white rug for the main living area, a small act of making the space her own. She remembered feeling a flicker of hope. Then Chloe, a petulant 22-year-old with her father's arrogance and none of his charm, had walked across that new rug. She was holding a glass of red wine, swirling it with a theatrical flourish. She'd caught Elizabeth's eye from across the room, a glint of challenge in her gaze. Then, the accident. Oops! Chloe had chirped, the dark red liquid splashing in a perfect, ugly arc across the pristine white wool. She looked down at the stain, then up at Elizabeth, her expression a perfect mask of faux innocence. Oh, clumsy me. But you're so good at cleaning things up, aren't you, Elizabeth? A younger Jacob, standing nearby, had snickered into his drink. The guests had pretended not to notice, their conversations faltering for a moment before nervously resuming. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread across Elizabeth's skin. She had just stood there, frozen. Richard had appeared then, gliding into the center of the scene with his effortless charisma. He put an arm around Chloe, another around Elizabeth. He was a master at diffusing tension, at smoothing over the cracks his children deliberately made. "Ah, a little party foul," he'd boomed, laughing. His laugh was a powerful instrument, capable of commanding a room and dismissing a person's pain in the same breath. "Don't you worry, darling," he said, giving Elizabeth's shoulder a squeeze. But he was looking at his daughter. "Chloe, you have to be more careful. This is why we can't have nice things." It was a joke, but the message was clear. The "we" did not include Elizabeth. He had then leaned in, his voice a low, confidential murmur, meant only for her. "Just let the staff handle it, Liz. There's no need to make a scene." He'd smiled, that dazzling, world-conquering smile, and walked away, leaving her standing by the ruined rug, a stain on her new life. He hadn't defended her. He had managed her. He had put her in her place as gently and as firmly as one places a vase on a shelf. She was an acquisition, and her feelings were an inconvenience. That was the moment the mask began to form, the slow, painstaking construction of a placid, agreeable facade. It was a survival mechanism. To fight back would have been to make a scene, to disrupt the smooth, frictionless world Richard demanded. So she had learned to be a ghost. Back in the present, the year 2025, she walked through the house that was legally hers, but had never felt like her own. The white rug was long gone, replaced by a cold, polished marble floor that reflected the harsh gallery lighting. Every piece of art, every stick of furniture, was a monument to Chloe's taste, or rather, the taste of the minimalist interior designer Chloe kept on retainer. A massive, sterile white sculpture of twisted metal stood where Elizabeth's warm, worn reading armchair used to be. A flickering, anxiety-inducing digital art piece, a frantic loop of shifting pixels, covered the wall where her collection of 19th-century botanical prints had once hung. Chloe had called them clutter. This house was a museum of her own erasure. She had been systematically scrubbed from its surfaces, her personality painted over with layers of beige and chrome. She was a ghost walking through the mausoleum of a life she was supposed to have lived. Her own personal touches were confined to a single, small bedroom at the back of the house, a room the designers had overlooked. It was the only place that felt real. Here, the walls were a soft, warm grey. Books, real books, with cracked spines and dog-eared pages, were stacked high on every surface. A worn, comfortable quilt, one she had owned long before she met Richard, was folded at the foot of the bed. On the nightstand was a single, small, silver-framed photograph. It wasn't of Richard, or Jacob, or Chloe. It was a much older photo of a young woman with fire in her eyes, standing next to a chalkboard covered in complex equations. A woman named Ava Hayes. Elizabeth looked at her reflection in the darkened window. For a moment, she saw the woman Jacob and Chloe saw. A quiet, tired, elderly woman. A harmless relic. But then she looked closer, past the fine lines around her eyes and the silver in her hair. She saw the ghost of the girl in the photograph. The fire wasn't out. It had just been banked, smouldering for 20 years, waiting for a breath of air. Chloe's insult, Maid, was that breath. It hadn't been an insult. It had been a key. It had unlocked a room in her mind that had been sealed for decades. They thought she was a ghost. They had no idea how right they were. A ghost is a memory with a purpose. A ghost has unfinished business. And a ghost can haunt the living in ways they can never imagine. The passivity was no longer a mask. It was now a camouflage. The cracks weren't a sign of weakness. They were the first signs of an earthquake. A week later, the air in the law offices of Thorne and Associates was even more sterile than the air at the mansion. It smelled of old paper and quiet, expensive power. The room was panelled in dark wood, lined with leather-bound books that looked as if they hadn't been opened in a century. It was a stage designed to convey permanence, stability, and the crushing weight of the law. Marcus Thorne sat behind a desk the size of a small car. He was a man in his late 60s, with a face like a worn leather briefcase creased, durable, and revealing nothing of its contents. He had been Richard Davenport's lawyer and confidant for 40 years. He had seen the rise of the empire, the first wife, the children, the divorce, and then the arrival of Elizabeth. He had watched the entire saga unfold with the dispassionate eye of a man who bills by the hour. Elizabeth sat opposite him, calm and composed. Jacob and Chloe sat beside her, a study in barely contained impatience. They leaned forward slightly in their chairs, like runners at the starting block. They viewed this meeting not as a solemn duty, but as the final administrative hurdle before they could claim their prize. Marcus cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He put on a pair of reading glasses and picked up a sheaf of papers. "We are here today to read the last will and testament of Richard C. Davenport," he began, his voice a dry monotone. He read through the usual legal boilerplate, the formal declarations and bequests to distant cousins and charities. Jacob fidgeted. Chloe was discreetly checking her phone beneath the level of the polished desk. Then, Marcus arrived at the main event. Regarding the primary residence located at 98XX Evergreen Point Road, Bellevue, Washington, and all its contents, he read, "I bequeath a life estate to my beloved wife, Elizabeth Davenport." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Furthermore, a stipend of $250,000 per year, adjusted for inflation, shall be paid to her from the estate for her personal upkeep and comfort for the remainder of her natural life." It continued, "Upon her passing, the aforementioned property and the principal of the trust funding, the stipend, shall revert in full to my children, Jacob Davenport and Chloe Davenport, in equal shares." Silence. Jacob's face, which had been tight with anticipation, was now a mask of cold fury. Chloe stared at the lawyer, her mouth slightly agape, the curated Instagram version of herself momentarily forgotten. It wasn't that they got nothing. It was that they had to wait. Waiting was not something the Davenport children did. Their inheritance was being held hostage by this woman's heartbeat. Jacob recovered first. He was a businessman, and this was just a negotiation that had hit a snag. The will was an obstacle, not a final judgment. He reached into his own expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a document. It was thick, professionally bound, and had the crisp, intimidating feel of something drafted by a team of very expensive lawyers. He slid it across the vast desk toward Elizabeth. "Well," Jacob said, his voice dangerously smooth, "that is surprisingly sentimental of father. But as Chloe said, we must be practical." He tapped a manicured finger on the document. "This is a formal offer, Elizabeth. We've had our people run the numbers. A full buyout of your life estate. We're prepared to offer you a lump sum payment of $5 million. Tax-free. It's more than generous." Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with false concern. "Think of it, Elizabeth. You'd be free. No more worrying about the leaky roof in the West Wing or the property taxes. You could buy a lovely place anywhere in the world. A condo in Palm Springs. A cottage in the Cotswolds. You could travel. It wasn't an offer. It was an eviction notice wrapped in the language of finance. It was an ultimatum. They had come prepared for this. They had assumed her compliance was a given. While Jacob was speaking, Chloe had her phone out again. Her thumbs moved with silent, vicious speed. She was crafting a new post. She selected a black and white shot of her as a teenager, laughing as Richard, looking young and powerful, lifted her onto his shoulders. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. She typed out the caption, her lips curled in a self-satisfied smirk. Honoring my father's memory means embracing the future and making hard choices for the good of the family. He taught us to be pioneers, not caretakers of the past. So grateful for his strength as we navigate these next steps. Number new beginnings. Number family first. Number Davenport legacy. She hit post without a moment's hesitation. The subtext was a sledgehammer. The old woman was the past. She was the future. Anyone who disagreed was disrespecting the great Richard Davenport's memory. Marcus Thorne watched all of this, his expression still unreadable. He looked from the aggressive legal document on his desk to the smug faces of the children, and finally to Elizabeth. He had known her for 20 years, and in all that time, he had barely heard her speak more than a few words at a time. He expected her to look intimidated, confused. He expected her to turn to him for guidance. She did not. Elizabeth looked at the buyout offer. She didn't touch it. Her gaze drifted from the document to Jacob's face, a mask of predatory expectation. She looked at Chloe, who was now watching the likes and comments pour in on her post. A small, triumphant smile on her face. Elizabeth saw them not as her stepchildren, but as opponents. She saw the board. She saw the pieces. And she saw her move. The silence in the room stretched for a full minute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. Jacob started to speak, to press his advantage, but stopped. There was something in Elizabeth's stillness that held him back. Finally, she lifted her eyes and met Marcus Thorne's gaze. Her own expression was as unreadable as his. Then she turned her head slightly and looked directly at Jacob. She said one word. Number. The word was not loud. It was not angry. It was not pleading. It was a simple statement of fact. Quiet. Clear. And utterly final. It landed in the center of the room with the force of a wrecking ball. Jacob stared at her, his mouth opening and closing silently for a moment. Like a fish. What? What do you mean, no? Chloe looked up from her phone, her eyes wide with disbelief. Don't be ridiculous, Elizabeth. It's a legal offer. It's $5 million. But Elizabeth was already pushing her chair back. She stood up, her movements fluid and unhurried. She gave a small, polite nod to Marcus Thorne, a gesture of dismissal. She didn't spare another glance for the sputtering, furious faces of her stepchildren. She simply turned and walked towards the door, her back straight, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. She left the word hanging in the air behind her, a declaration of war. She had been a ghost in her own home, a silent mourner, a caged bird. But the cage door was now open, and the ghost was about to learn how to fly. The silence Jacob and Chloe left behind was louder than their screaming. It was a hollow, ringing void where their entitlement used to be. I watched them go from the foyer window, Jacob's shoulders rigid with a fury he couldn't aim. Chloe's face contorted, already plotting her next attack on a battlefield she didn't understand. They slammed the car doors, a punctuation mark on a sentence they thought they had written. But they were merely characters in a story I had authored 4 decades ago. They sped down the long, winding driveway, away from the house they believed was their birthright. Theirs. A laughable concept. For a moment, I stood there, letting the last echo of their rage fade into the marble floors. I felt the familiar weight of the Elizabeth persona settle back over me, the slight stoop in my shoulders, the soft, hesitant way I held my hands. It was a costume I had worn for 20 years. It was comfortable. It was safe. It was a cage I had built for myself, bar by golden bar. But the door had just been rattled, and the occupant was finally awake. I didn't turn towards the grand staircase that led to my lonely, chaste bedroom. I didn't head for the kitchen to busy my hands, as the helpmeet persona would have demanded. Instead, I turned left, down the West Wing corridor, a part of the house Chloe had always called Dad's Wing, as if I were a guest not permitted to cross its threshold. My steps were slow, deliberate, each one shedding a layer of the frail old woman. The slippers, a gift from Chloe Gray, sensible, orthopedic made, a soft, shuffling sound on the polished oak. With each step, my spine straightened. The shuffle became a stride. I stopped before the imposing double doors of Richard's office. His sanctuary. The place where he worked. The place where he took my genius and presented it to the world as his own. Chloe had tried to get the combination for the lock from him for years. Jacob had once hired a locksmith who had spent a day trying to crack it before giving up, muttering about military-grade encryption. The door was solid mahogany, a statement of power and privacy. To them, it was a vault. To me, it was just a door. I lifted my right hand. The skin was thin, wrinkled, spotted with age. A hand that had poured tea, arranged flowers, and clutched nervously at shawls. A hand they saw as weak and useless. I pressed my thumb against the small, dark glass panel set discreetly into the wall beside the door frame. There was no sound, no click. Just a thin line of green light that appeared for a second before vanishing. Then, with a deep, pneumatic hiss, the heavy locks disengaged. The door swung inward, silent on its perfectly engineered hinges. I stepped inside. The air was cool, filtered, smelling of electronics and ozone, a sterile scent so different from the potpourri and old money smell that permeated the rest of the mansion. The door hissed shut behind me, sealing me in, sealing the world out. Here, in this room, I was not Elizabeth Davenport, the grieving widow. I was not the meek woman they had tried to discard. I was the architect. I moved to the center of the room, to the massive black desk that was less a piece of furniture and more a command console. I sat in the leather chair, the one Richard had always occupied, the one that still held the faint scent of his expensive cologne. My body sank into it, but my spirit rose. The stoop was gone. The hesitation vanished. The woman who sat there now was someone Jacob and Chloe had never met. Her eyes were clear, focused, and cold as ice. My fingers, no longer trembling, flew across a dark, unmarked keyboard. One by one, 6 large monitors embedded in the opposite wall flickered to life, bathing my face in a cool blue-white glow. They were not filled with stock photos or corporate logos. They were filled with data, streams of it. On the far left, the intricate labyrinthine schematics of offshore financial structures. Shell corporations nested within shell corporations, with names like Spectres Ethelred Holdings, Cygnus Ventures, Peregrine Trustall based in jurisdictions that ask no questions. I saw the real-time flow of capital moving silently through the digital veins of the global economy, all controlled by me. I watched millions of dollars shift from an account in the Caymans to another in Zurich with a few keystrokes, a routine transaction I performed weekly to test the system's integrity. The central monitors displayed the heart of the empire. The source code for every major innovation Davenport Innovations had ever produced. There it was. Prometheus, the predictive analytics algorithm that had made the company a giant in the defense sector. Richard had given a speech at Davos about it, accepting thunderous applause for his creation. I remembered writing that code in a cramped Palo Alto apartment, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning need to prove a ghost could build a god. Beside it, the patent schematics for our revolutionary neural interface technology. Complex, beautiful, and utterly mine. On the right, legal documents. Not the flimsy Will Marcus Thorne had read, the one designed to be a piece of bait. No, these were the real documents. The founding charters, the partnership agreements. I pulled up the master file, a blockchain encrypted document created in 1985. Immutable and eternal. It was a simple partnership agreement between Richard Davenport and Ava Hayes. It stipulated a 51/49 ownership split in my favor. It gave me absolute control, veto power, and a survivorship clause that was as brutal as it was simple. Upon the death of one partner, all assets, personal and corporate, would transfer immediately and irrevocably to the other. The will was a performance, a piece of theatre for an audience of two greedy children. This was the scripture upon which the Church of Davenport was built, and they were about to be excommunicated. For 20 years I had played the part of the sparrow, the gentle, harmless creature Richard kept in a gilded cage. I had endured the slights, the insults, the calculated cruelties of his children. I had smiled meekly when Chloe redecorated my home around me, turning it into her own sterile showroom. I had held my tongue when Jacob spoke to me as if I were a simple-minded servant. I had let them believe I was nothing, because that was the price of the pact. Richard needed a respectable, quiet wife to complete his image as a captain of industry. And I needed a place to hide in plain sight. But the pact had a time limit. It ended with Richard's last breath. The cage door was now open. They thought they were pushing a frail old woman out of her home. They didn't understand. They were trying to evict the very foundation of the house. They thought this was a skirmish over an inheritance. They were wrong. This was a war for my life's work, my identity, my soul. And I, the ghost in their machine, was finally ready to haunt them. I looked at the screens, at the empire I had built in secret, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. The performance was over. Jacob's fury was a physical thing, a hot buzzing under his skin. He gripped the steering wheel of his Porsche so hard his knuckles were white, the engine roaring as he tore away from the mansion. Number. That one word. That one. Quiet. Impossibly firm. Number. It replayed in his mind, a grain of sand in the gears of his world. Who the hell did she think she was? For 20 years, she had been a piece of furniture, a silent, nodding prop in the grand drama of his father's life. And now? Now she was saying no to him. He pulled over to the side of the road, the tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. He needed to reassert control. He needed to put her back in her box. He snatched his phone, his thumb jabbing at the screen. He found the number for the family's private bank, a Swiss institution so discreet they probably didn't even have a sign on their building. "Mr. Sterling, please." Jacob Davenport. He didn't wait for the pleasantries. The moment the banker's smooth, accented voice came on the line, Jacob launched his attack. "Sterling, it's Jacob. I need you to do something for me. I want you to freeze all of Elizabeth Davenport's accounts. All of them. The household accounts, her personal allowance, everything. Effective immediately." There was a polite pause on the other end of the line. "Good afternoon, Mr. Davenport. My condolences again on the passing of your father. He was a valued client." Yes, thank you. Did you hear what I said? Freeze them. The woman is unstable, grief-stricken. She's not in her right mind. We're concerned she's going to be reckless." The lie came easily, smoothly. It was the narrative he and Chloe had been rehearsing for years. Mr. Sterling's voice remained perfectly calm, a placid lake of professional detachment. I understand your concern, Mr. Davenport. However, I'm afraid I cannot do that. Jacob's jaw tightened. What do you mean you can't? I'm Richard Davenport's son. It's my family's money. With respect, sir, the primary household accounts are held in a joint trust. Your father was the primary trustee. Following his passing, per the trust's foundational documents, sole signatory authority transfers to the surviving spouse, Mrs. Elizabeth Davenport. I have no legal authority to act on your instructions regarding those funds. Jacob felt a hot flush of anger. This is ridiculous. There has to be a way. Furthermore, Mr. Sterling continued, his tone unchanging. As for what you term her personal allowance, I must clarify. Mrs. Davenport maintains several independent portfolios with us, established under a separate holding corporation. These are not connected to the family estate. Jacob's mind went blank for a second. Independent portfolios? Plural? What are you talking about? What holding corporation? I'm not at liberty to disclose the specifics of a client's holdings, you understand? Sterling said, a hint of something that might have been enjoyment in his voice. But I can assure you, the funds within these accounts are quite secure. Mrs. Davenport's personal liquidity, managed through her own designated entities, is, shall we say, substantial. Substantial? What does that mean? A few million? Jacob sneered, trying to regain his footing. His father probably set her up with a little nest egg to keep her quiet. There was another slight pause. Sir, substantial in this context means her personal liquid assets exceed the value of the main Davenport family joint funds by an order of magnitude. The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. Order of magnitude. 10 times. At least. He couldn't speak. His throat was dry. He thought about the family's funds, the tens of millions he and Chloe were so eager to control. And this woman, this quiet, grey woman, had 10 times that, sitting in her own private accounts. It wasn't possible. The numbers didn't compute. The world tilted on its axis. Mr. Davenport, are you still there? Jacob ended the call without a word. He sat in his car, the engine idling, his mind racing. Who was she? Who was this woman his father had married? The story he'd always told himself, a nobody. A charity case. A pretty face. Who got lucky crumbled into dust. The shock quickly curdled into a new, colder fear. This wasn't about a house anymore. This was about a threat he couldn't comprehend. He needed leverage. He needed a weapon. He needed to know who she was before she was Elizabeth Davenport. His fingers, now trembling slightly, dialed another number. A man named Fisher, a private investigator who was expensive, discreet, and had no morals. Fisher, Jacob barked when the man answered. I have a job for you. A deep dive. The woman's name is Elizabeth Davenport. Maiden name. I don't even know her maiden name. Check the marriage certificate. I want everything. I want to know who she was before 2005, before she met my father. I'm telling you, this woman came from nothing. She was probably a grifter, a waitress, a stripper. I don't care. Find the dirt. Find the criminal record. The bankruptcies. The angry ex-boyfriends. I want something I can use to destroy her. I want it. Yesterday. 3 days later, Jacob was sitting in his own sterile, minimalist office, staring at a one-page report from Fisher. It was the shortest investigative report he'd ever received. He had been expecting a thick file full of sordid details, a history he could use to shame and blackmail her into submission. Instead, there was almost nothing. He called Fisher. his voice tight with frustration. What is this? This is all you found? Her marriage certificate to my father. A social security number issued in 2004? This is useless. Fisher's voice was gravelly. And for the first time, Jacob heard a note of genuine puzzlement in it. Mr. Davenport, you don't understand. It's not that we couldn't find any dirt on her. It's that we couldn't find anything. What are you talking about? I mean, there are no records for an Elizabeth Wallace's that was the maiden name on the certificate prior to 2004. No birth certificate that we can verify. No school records. No tax filings. No credit history. No driver's license. No passport. We ran facial recognition against every database we have access to, public and private. Nothing. It's like she was born on the day that Social Security number was issued. Before she married your father, your stepmother is a ghost, a digital black hole. In all my years, I've never seen anything like it. It's not just clean, it's empty, as if her entire past was professionally and methodically erased. Jacob hung up the phone, the single sheet of paper trembling in his hand. An empty past. A fortune that dwarfed his own. A quiet no that carried the weight of a vault door slamming shut. The first cracks were appearing in the foundation of his world. And for the first time in his life, Jacob Davenport felt a tremor of pure, undiluted fear. While Jacob was hitting a wall of digital nothingness, Chloe was fighting her war on a different front. Her battlefield was the court of public opinion, and her weapons were exquisitely filtered photos and weaponized captions. She sat propped up in her enormous bed, a silk robe draped over her shoulders, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone. She was an artist, and her medium was outrage. She scrolled through her camera roll, past hundreds of selfies and party pictures, looking for the perfect images, not the ones where Elizabeth looked nice. She found one from Richard's 70th birthday party. Elizabeth was in the background, slightly out of focus, carrying a tray of empty champagne glasses, her face looking tired under the harsh lights. Chloe zoomed in, cropped it, and typed. Her caption was a masterpiece of passive aggression. So blessed to have had such an incredible father. He gave so much to so many. Some people enter a family and just take. It's heartbreaking to watch. Number family first. Number grief. Number protecting his legacy. She posted it to her too. 3 million followers on Instagram. The reaction was immediate. A Pavlovian response she had cultivated over years. The comments flooded in. A torrent of algorithm-fueled vitriol. OMG Chloe, stay strong. We see you. Cather, that old woman always looked miserable. Total gold digger. Justice for Richard. Vultures. Kick her out. It's your family home. I bet she's trying to steal everything. Disgusting. Chloe smiled. It was so easy. You just had to give people a simple story, a villain and a hero. They would do the rest. She posted another photo, this one from a Christmas long ago. Elizabeth was sitting slightly apart from the family, wearing a simple grey dress Chloe had once called mousy. The caption, Memories. Family is about who belongs, not who just shows up. Sending love to everyone holding their true family tight today. Number legacy. Number true family. In another part of the gigantic house, in a room filled with the low hum of a high-end gaming PC, Chloe's son Leo was oblivious. At 19, Leo was the quiet antithesis of his mother. Where she was loud, he was silent. Where she craved the spotlight, he craved the cool, logical certainty of code. He was scrolling through a gaming forum on one monitor while a line of Python script compiled on another. He only glanced at his social media feed out of boredom. His mother's posts were at the top. He cringed. It was so performative. So tacky. He had never disliked Elizabeth. She was just there, a quiet, background presence. She always asked him about his computer science classes and actually seemed to listen to the answer, unlike his parents, who just nodded and smiled before changing the subject. He was about to click away when he noticed something odd in the comment section of his mother's latest post. Buried beneath the mountain of sycophantic praise and mindless hate, there were a few strange replies. They weren't emotional, they were clinical. An account named Factual Observer 82 with a default avatar and 0 followers had replied to a comment that said, "Richard built that company from nothing." The reply read, "Incorrect. Davenport Innovations' seed funding in 1986 came from the acquisition of 3 core patents from a defunct research entity, Finch Miller Labs, public record." Leo's eyebrows went up. Who comments like that? He scrolled further. Another anonymous account, Data Point 01, replied to Chloe's caption about protecting his legacy. The reply was short and devastating. The legacy is secured by patent 8,451,988, the Odyssey processor architecture. That patent is not held by the Davenport estate, but by a privately owned shell corporation. Ethelred Holdings, registered in Grand Cayman. Leo stopped scrolling. He knew that patent number. It was the cornerstone of the company. The thing that powered everything. He'd studied it. But Ethelred Holdings? He'd never heard of it. And how would some random troll know that level of detail? This wasn't just gossip. This was inside information. His curiosity, a quiet but powerful force, was fully engaged. This was a puzzle. He clicked on the profiles, both created within the last 24 hours. New posts, new followers, new personnel information. He ran a quick script to try and trace the IP addresses. It was a fool's errand, he knew, but he had to try. As expected, the signal bounced. A VPN in Sweden, routed through a proxy in Romania, terminating at a server farm in Delaware. A server farm owned by Cygnus Ventures, another name he didn't recognize. This wasn't a random defender. This was a coordinated, sophisticated operation. Someone was fighting his mother's firestorm of public opinion, not with emotion, but with a quiet, steady stream of ice-cold facts. Someone was protecting Elizabeth. But who? And why go to such lengths to stay hidden? Leo leaned back in his chair, the game forgotten, the code ignored. The quiet woman who lived down the hall, the woman his mother was painting as a villain, was suddenly the most interesting mystery he had ever encountered. The whispers on the web were just the beginning, and Leo was determined to find their source. The blue glow of Leo's monitor dissolved, the pixels melting away into the fuzzy, flickering green of a different screen, 40 years earlier. It was 1,985. The air in the university lab smelled of burnt coffee, rosine core solder, and the low-grade desperation of graduate students. This was my world. Not the opulent mansion, but a cluttered basement room filled with humming machinery and the ghosts of failed experiments. I was not Elizabeth then. I was Ava Hayes. I was 25, and I was a genius, and I was being eaten alive. I sat before a humming mini-computer, my fingers flying across the keyboard. The code flowed out of me, a language I understood better than English. It was an algorithm for a new kind of artificial intelligence, a self-correcting neural network that learned not from datasets but from inference. It was revolutionary. It was my soul translated into logic, and it was being stolen from me. One line at a time. Progressing nicely, Ava. The voice behind me was smooth, paternal, and laced with the casual poison of ownership. Dr. Alistair Finch. To the world, he was a celebrated pioneer in computer science, a titan of academia. To me, he was a monster in a tweed jacket. He leaned over my shoulder, his presence crowding me, his breath smelling of stale mints. "Our work is about to change the world," he said. The word "our," a casual theft. He pointed a manicured finger at my screen. "I think if we adjust the heuristic decay parameter here, we might see a significant performance increase. I'll make a note for my paper." His paper. Not our paper. My heuristic decay parameter. I had implemented it last night, after a 16-hour session. I said nothing. I had learned that arguing was pointless. It only led to him questioning my emotional stability or my commitment to the project. He cultivated an image of me as a brilliant but volatile protégé, one he had to carefully manage. It was a cage of a different sort, built not of gold but of condescension. I met Richard Davenport in a noisy, crowded bar near campus. He wasn't a student. He was an MBA from Stanford, all sharp angles, a sharper suit, and a predatory smile. He didn't know anything about code, but he knew everything about value. He had been talking to some of Finch's other students, and he had heard my name. Not as a genius, but as Finch's secret weapon. He bought me a drink. He didn't ask about my work. He asked about my frustration. "Finch is a vampire, isn't he?" he said, his voice low over the music. He didn't wait for an answer. "He's getting famous, presenting your ideas as his own. He gets the grants, the tenure, the acclaim. What do you get, Ava? A pat on the head and a footnote in his publications." The bluntness of it startled me. No one had ever spoken of it so plainly. I just stared at him. "I've read his papers," Richard continued, leaning in. "And then I read your graduate thesis. It's funny how all his breakthroughs seem to happen about 6 months after you've already documented the core concepts. He's not your mentor. He's your parasite." He saw it in my eyes. The years of quiet fury, the humiliation, the exhaustion. He saw a resource being squandered. He saw an opportunity. "What if," he said, his eyes gleaming, "we took it all back? Not just the algorithm. Everything. What if we drain the vampire dry and leave him wasting in the sun?" The proposal was audacious, terrifying, and more seductive than anything I had ever heard. He laid it out in that dingy bar. My algorithm was the key. Finch was about to present it at a major conference, claiming it as the culmination of his life's work. Richard's plan was simple and brutal. We would form a company. We would use the algorithm to secure a massive round of venture capital before Finch even got to the podium. We would patent it under the new company's name, effectively stealing my own work back. By the time Finch realized what had happened, his reputation would be in tatters, exposed as a fraud who had been beaten to the market. "You're the genius, Ava. You have the product. I know the people with the money. I can sell it. I can build the business around it. Together, we can build an empire." I was tempted, but I was also afraid. Finch was powerful. He had connections everywhere. If he found out I had crossed him, he would destroy me. He would blacklist me from every university, every research lab in the country. He would make sure I never worked in my field again. "He'll come after me," I whispered. "He'll never stop." Richard nodded slowly. "You're right. He will. Unless you cease to exist." And that was his final, brilliant, terrifying proposition. For the plan to work, for me to be truly safe, Ava Hayes had to disappear. "I will be the face," he said, his voice a hypnotic whisper. "I will be the king, the charismatic founder on the cover of magazines. And you will be the god, the ghost in the machine. No name, no records. The hidden brain that makes it all work. You'll have the power, the control, the majority ownership. But no one will ever know it's you. He can't hunt a ghost." It was a devil's bargain. To gain everything, I had to sacrifice my name, my identity, my past. I had to become a living secret. I looked at Richard, at his ambition, which was a perfect mirror of my own. We weren't friends. We were not lovers. We were two predators who recognized each other, forging an alliance. I agreed. On one condition: my ownership, my control, had to be absolute and ironclad. 51%, veto power, and a survivorship clause. It was my only guarantee. Richard, seeing the ruthless logic, agreed instantly. We didn't seal the deal with a handshake. We sealed it with fire. A few nights later, we met in a deserted parking lot. I brought a small metal box. Inside was everything that proved I was Ava Hayes. My birth certificate, my university diploma, my student ID, my driver's license. Richard brought a can of lighter fluid and a match. I watched as he doused the small pile of documents. I looked at my own face on the driver's license. A young woman with tired but hopeful eyes. For a second, I hesitated. This was a kind of death. "Are you sure?" Richard asked, holding the unlit match. I thought of Finch's condescending smile. I thought of my name in a footnote. I thought of a lifetime of being someone else's secret weapon. "Do it," I said. He struck the match. The flame leaped up, catching the edge of my birth certificate. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The plastic of my ID card bubbled and melted, my face distorting into a grotesque mask before vanishing into the flames. We stood there in silence, watching my entire history burn away under the cold, indifferent stars. Ava Hayes was gone. In her place was a ghost, a promise, and the silent partner of a future empire. The price of my safety was anonymity. The price of my power was invisibility. It was a price I had been paying every single day for 40 years. The legal papers arrived not as a surprise, but as a declaration of war. They were thick, heavy with the self-importance of the law firm that had drafted them, and they smelled of expensive ink and Jacob's impotent rage. He had filed suit. The official claim was undue influence, a legal term for a whisper campaign, for poison poured in an old man's ear over 2 decades. The petition painted a picture of a feeble, mentally declining Richard Davenport, manipulated by a cunning and predatory caregiver who had isolated him from his loving family. Jacob felt confident. His private investigator, a former cop with a bulldog jaw and an air of perpetual disappointment, had presented his findings in a glossy binder. "It's a ghost," the investigator said, tapping a page. "This Elizabeth Graham identity. It's a work of art. Born in a small town in Idaho that burned down in 85. Hospital, town hall, all records gone. Social security number issued in 88. First driver's license in 89. It's perfect. Too perfect. A paper trail this clean for someone her age. It's not real. It was built. Someone with a lot of skill and a lot of resources created her out of thin air. So we can use that," Jacob said, pacing his minimalist office, the city skyline glittering behind him. "We can say she's a fraud, a professional con artist." The investigator shook his head slowly. "Number. You can't, because from 1988 onward, she's been flawless. Paid her taxes, no debt. Not so much as a parking ticket. You take this to a judge, and her lawyer will say, 'So what? The records were lost in a fire. It was a tragedy. You'll look like you're persecuting an old woman for being the victim of a town disaster.' There's nothing to attack. It's a digital fortress with no doors." The frustration was a physical thing in Jacob's chest, a tightness that made his breath short. He had spent a fortune on this, and all he had was a ghost story. "So what do I have?" he snarled. "You have public perception," the investigator said. flipping to the back of the binder. He'd included printed screenshots of Chloe's social media posts, the carefully curated photos of a vibrant, loving family, the sad, reflective captions about their father's final years, and the comments, a tidal wave of them, thousands of people, complete strangers, calling Elizabeth a gold digger, a parasite, a monster hiding behind a kindly face. Chloe had even started a hashtag, number justice for Richard. And you have this, the man added, sliding a dozen 8x10 glossies across the polished desk. They were photos taken over the years at family events, holidays, charity galas. In every single one, Elizabeth was in the background. She was serving drinks. She was clearing plates. She was standing by the door holding coats. In one particularly damning photo from Chloe's last birthday, she was on her hands and knees, dabbing at a wine stain on the carpet while Chloe and her friends laughed at something just out of frame. She wasn't a wife. She was the help. Jacob stared at the photo. His sister had been brilliant. That stain wasn't an accident. It was an investment. This is what we use, Jacob said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. We don't need to prove who she was. We just need to prove what she was. The servant who got greedy. A jury will understand that. His lawyer, a man named Sterling who charged $2,000 an hour to look confident, agreed. It's a powerful narrative, Jacob. The grieving son and daughter protecting their father's legacy from the hired help who bewitched him. We'll depose her. We'll put her on the stand and break her. We'll ask her about her duties in the house. We'll show the jury these photos. By the time we're done, they'll see a manipulative shrew who played the long game. The will is going to be invalidated. It's just a matter of time. Jacob leaned back in his leather chair, the anger finally giving way to a pleasant, cold certainty. He looked at the picture of Elizabeth on her knees, her face a mask of quiet resignation. He was going to crush her. He was going to take back his house, his father's company, his world. And then he was going to ship her off to the cheapest, greyest nursing home he could find, where she could live out her final days, remembering what happened when a servant got above her station. While Jacob sharpened his legal knives, Leo fought a different kind of war in the blue glow of his monitors. The online battle was ugly, a cesspool of accusations and vitriol directed at his grandmother. But underneath the noise, there was a signal, a small, persistent group of anonymous accounts that fought back. They didn't use emotion. They used facts. When one of Chloe's followers called Elizabeth a gold digger who knew nothing about the company, an account named Archimedes, 7, would reply with a stunningly detailed, non-public analysis of Davenport Innovations Q3 1995 semiconductor logistics chain, pointing out a strategic pivot that saved the company from a market downturn. A pivot, the account noted, that occurred just months after Richard married Elizabeth. When another user claimed she was just a pretty face, Oracle 1985 would post a link to a dense academic paper on neural network architecture from the early 80s, then add the comment, "True genius is often quiet." They were ghosts in the machine, defending Elizabeth with a level of technical and historical knowledge that was impossible for an outsider to possess. Leo felt a chill crawl up his spine. This wasn't a PR firm. This was something else. For 3 days, he didn't sleep. He lived on energy drinks and cold pizza, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He ran traces, broke through firewalls, and followed digital breadcrumbs through a labyrinth of shell corporations and rerouted servers. The anonymous defenders were masters of obfuscation, their digital footprints scattered across a dozen countries. But they all led back to one place. A single, heavily encrypted, privately owned server. A server registered to a shell corporation called AH Holdings. Leo's heart hammered in his chest. Ah, Ava Hayes. It had to be. The corporation had no employees, no public profile, no products. According to its financial records, which took him another 18 hours to crack, It had only one function. For nearly 40 years, AH Holdings had been making a quarterly payment of $2 million. The recipient was a private, high-security medical facility in a remote, fog-shrouded corner of rural Oregon. The facility was called Northwood Sanctuary. Leo's blood ran cold. He had seen that name before. Digging through the terabytes of data he had pulled from his grandmother's secret server, he ran a search. A single encrypted file popped up. A payment ledger from one of Elizabeth's hidden accounts. The amounts and dates matched the AH Holdings transfers perfectly. A recurring payment for the permanent, long-term care of a single patient. There was no name attached to the file, just a patient designation. John Doe. Admitted. The 12th of October, 1986. 1986. The year after Richard and Ava Hayes, according to her own story, had destroyed Dr. Alistair Finch and founded their company. The year Finch disappeared off the face of the earth. A chilling, horrifying realization began to dawn in the deep, quiet corners of Leo's mind. A truth so monstrous he could barely let himself think it. He didn't call, he didn't text, he drove. He bypassed the mansion's main security. His own code still worked and made his way through the silent, sleeping house. The air was heavy, oppressive with unspoken secrets. He found her where he knew she would be. In the command center. She wasn't looking at the stock tickers or the global news feeds that usually filled the wall of screens. She was looking at a single black and white satellite image of a secluded compound surrounded by pine trees in Oregon, Northwood Sanctuary. She didn't seem surprised to see him. She simply turned in her chair, her face calm, her eyes ancient. She looked tired, but not defeated. She looked like a general on the eve of the final battle. Leo didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse her. The horror was too profound for anger. He slowly walked forward and placed his tablet on the glowing console in front of her. On the screen were the two payment ledgers, side by side. The one from AH Holdings and the one from her personal account. A perfect match. A 40-year-old secret laid bare in two columns of numbers. He looked at the woman who had baked him cookies, who had helped him with his calculus homework, who he had always known as his quiet, gentle grandmother. His voice was a raw whisper, thick with a dread that was suffocating him. "Grandma, who is John Doe?" The deposition was held in the main boardroom on the top floor of the Davenport Innovations tower. It was a sterile, intimidating space, all glass and brushed steel, dominated by a monolithic black marble table. The room was designed to project power, to make visitors feel small. Jacob and Chloe certainly felt powerful. They sat with their lawyer, Sterling, looking smug and confident. Chloe was dressed in a severe black suit, her face a mask of performative grief. Jacob kept checking his platinum watch, radiating impatience. They were ready for the kill. They believed this was a formality, the first step in dismantling the old woman's pathetic fantasy. Elizabeth arrived with Marcus Thorne. She had resurrected the role she had played for 20 years. She was the frail widow, leaning on her lawyer's arm, her eyes downcast. She wore a simple grey dress, her hands clasped in her lap. She looked small and breakable. Jacob smirked. It was perfect. Sterling began the proceeding. His voice was a smooth, condescending purr. He was a shark that smelled blood. "Mrs. Davenport," he began. "Thank you for joining us. We just have a few questions to clarify the nature of your relationship with your late husband, Richard Davenport, particularly in his final years." Elizabeth nodded meekly. "Of course. Good. Let's start with your role in the household. Would you describe it as that of a partner or more of a companion?" "I was his wife," Elizabeth said softly. Of course. His wife. And as his wife, you took on many duties, did you not? Managing the staff? Organizing social events? Seeing to Mr. Davenport's personal needs? I did what was needed. I see. Sterling slid one of the glossy photographs across the vast table. It was the one of her on her knees, cleaning the wine stain. Was this needed, Mrs. Davenport? Getting on your hands and knees to clean up after my client's birthday party? Is that a task you would expect of, say, the wife of a billionaire CEO? Chloe's lips twitched in a triumphant little smile. Elizabeth looked at the photo without emotion. There was a spill. I cleaned it. Like a maid would, Sterling pushed. You acted as a servant in your own home, did you not? I cared for my husband and his family. Ah, for 20 years, you lived in that house. And in all that time, you never once attended a board meeting. You never once took a business call for your husband. You never once participated in a strategic decision for the company. Is that correct? Richard handled the business, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Exactly. Sterling leaned back, a look of triumph on his face. He looked at Jacob, a silent confirmation. This was it. The narrative was set. The servant who got lucky, he was about to move in for the final brutal line of questioning that would paint her as a manipulative gold digger who took advantage of a sick old man. But Elizabeth held up a single, delicate hand. The gesture was small, but it commanded the room. The air shifted. The meekness in her eyes was gone, replaced by a glint of something hard and ancient, like polished stone. This, she said, her voice suddenly clear and steady, cutting through the smug atmosphere of the room, is all a complete and utter waste of time. Silence. Jacob stared. Chloe's smile froze on her face. Sterling's mouth hung open slightly. Elizabeth turned her gaze to her own lawyer. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Marcus. Marcus Thorne, who had been sitting silently, his face a mask of grim resignation, reached into his worn leather briefcase. He pulled out a single, slender folder. It was plain manila, with no markings. He stood up, his joints creaking, and walked slowly around the table. He didn't offer a defense. He didn't make an argument. He placed the folder on the marble table directly in front of Sterling. It landed with a soft, final thud. This wasn't a defense. It was an execution. Sterling, looking confused, opened the folder. His eyes scanned the first page. Then he went back and read it again, slower this time. The colour drained from his face. He looked up at Elizabeth. His professional arrogance completely gone, replaced by something that looked like fear. "What is it?" Jacob demanded, his voice tight with irritation. Sterling didn't answer. He slid the folder over to Jacob. Inside was not a legal brief. It was not a counter-motion. It was a single, ironclad, multi-page document. At the top of the first page, in stark typeset letters, were the words, Partnership Agreement. It detailed the formation of a holding company in 1985, the entity that would acquire a portfolio of foundational patents and eventually be incorporated as Davenport Innovations. It was signed, in black ink that was still sharp after 40 years, by two parties. The first signature was Richard Davenport's, bold and arrogant. The second was a neat, precise script, Ava Hayes. The agreement was brilliantly simple. It stipulated a partnership structure. Richard Davenport was the public face, the CEO, the chairman. He held a 49% stake. Ava Hayes was the silent partner, the chief architect of technology. She held a 51% controlling interest. And then there was the final clause, a clause so vicious and absolute it took Jacob's breath away. Upon the event of Richard Davenport's death, all assets, shares, intellectual property, real estate holdings, and subsidiary accounts controlled by the partnership would not pass to his estate. They would not be subject to his will. They would revert, entirely and immediately, to the sole undisputed ownership of the majority partner, Ava Hayes. The will they had fought over, the will that gave her the house and a stipend, was a phantom, a legal decoy, a piece of theatre designed to draw their fire, to lure them into this very room, into this very trap. She didn't just own the house, she owned the company, the stock, the patents, the skyscraper they were sitting in. She owned their trust funds, their cars, their summer homes. She owned their entire world. A profound, suffocating silence fell over the boardroom. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's climate control. Chloe stared, her mouth agape, her carefully constructed mask of grief cracking to reveal sheer, uncomprehending horror. Jacob's face was a ruin. The colour, the arrogance, the life it all just drained away, leaving behind a grey, hollowed-out shell. He looked from the signature on the page, Ava Hayes, the old woman sitting across from him. The woman he had called a servant. The woman he had tried to evict. And he finally understood. He had not been fighting a mouse. He had been trying to swat a dragon. The silence was shattered by a sound that was not human. It was a raw, hysterical shriek of pure rage and disbelief, torn from Chloe's throat. "Leah!" she screamed, lunging to her feet, her chair crashing backwards onto the floor. "You're a thief! You murdered him. You killed our father and you stole everything." She scrambled across the table, hands hooked into claws, aiming for Elizabeth's face. Jacob, jolted from his stupor, grabbed her around the waist, his own strength barely enough to hold back her thrashing, frenzied attack. "Chloe, stop! Stop it!" Elizabeth didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She watched Chloe's hysterical breakdown with the detached calm of a scientist observing a specimen. The frail widow was gone forever. In her place sat Ava Hayes, and her eyes were like chips of ice. She looked directly at the screaming, struggling Chloe, but her words were for everyone in the room. They were quiet, but they carried the weight of a death sentence. "Murder," she said, the word dripping with contempt. "Number, your father's death was a kindness. Murdering him would have been a mistake. It would have been wasteful." Her gaze shifted, moving past the wreckage of Jacob and Chloe, and settled on the one person who had been standing silently in the corner of the room the entire time. Leo. He hadn't moved, his face pale, his eyes wide with a horror that went far beyond money or inheritance. Elizabeth's expression softened, but only for a fraction of a second. It was a flicker of something that might have once been affection, now twisted into a lesson. "Your grandfather and I were very careful business people, Leo," she said, her voice now dangerously gentle. "We understood one fundamental rule. You never, ever destroy a valuable asset." She tapped a command into her phone. The massive 80-inch monitor on the boardroom wall, which had been displaying the Davenport Innovations logo, flickered to life. It was a live video feed. The view was from a ceiling-mounted camera, looking down into a sterile, white medical room. There was a bed, a vital signs monitor, and in the center of the room, a chair. An old man, with vacant, clouded eyes, sat strapped into it. His head was shaved, and a complex, glittering neuro-interface headset was clamped tightly to his skull. Wires snaked from the headset to a humming bank of servers against the far wall. On a screen in front of him, incomprehensible lines of code and complex quantum equations scrolled past at an impossible speed. The man's hands twitched in his lap. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His body was a husk, a forgotten shell. But behind the vacant eyes, his mind was on fire. It was a pure processing engine, a biological supercomputer, stripped of all personality, all consciousness, all humanity. A mind trapped in an endless loop of problem-solving. Leo felt the air leave his lungs. John Doe. Elizabeth's voice was as soft as falling snow, and as cold as the grave. "Children!" she said. The word a final, mocking insult. Meet Dr. Alistair Finch, the genius, the true brain behind every key patent, every innovation, every dollar Davenport Innovations has made for the last 40 years. She let the reality sink in, a poison seeping into the air of the room. Jacob stopped struggling with Chloe, his arms falling to his sides. Chloe's screams died in her throat, replaced by a choked, gasping sound. They both stared at the screen, at the ghost they had only ever heard of, the man their father had supposedly vanquished. Ava Hayes delivered the final, horrific truth. Your legacy isn't built on your father's brilliance. He was a salesman, a charismatic fraud. Your fortune, your entire lives, everything you are so proud of, it's all built on the brain of a man we've kept lobotomized in a cage. The image on the screen was the ultimate cruelty. The final, unspeakable secret at the heart of the Davenport empire. They didn't just steal Alistair Finch's work. They had stolen his mind. And for 4 decades, they had been harvesting it like a crop. The video feed clicked off, but the image remained, burned onto the inside of every eyelid in the room. Dr. Alistair Finch, his eyes vacant, a thin line of drool tracing a path through the grey stubble on his chin, wires sprouting from his shaven scalp like some grotesque technological crown. A ghost, a living ghost who had been powering their lives for 40 years. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, suffocating. It was the sound of a universe collapsing. The first human sound was a wet, guttural heave. Chloe, on her hands and knees, vomited into a polished chrome wastebasket. The sound was ugly, violent, a physical rejection of a truth her mind couldn't process. Her meticulously tailored Chanel suit was wrinkled, her perfect blonde hair hanging in limp strands over her face. She looked like a broken doll. Jacob didn't move. He sat in the chair he'd stumbled back into, his chest rising and falling in ragged, shallow gasps. His face was the colour of old parchment. He stared at the blank screen, but he was seeing Finch. He was seeing his father, Richard, not as a titan of industry, but as a grave robber, a body snatcher, a monster. And what did that make him? What was he? Jacob Davenport, son of the monster. He was the heir to the atrocity. The money in his wallet, the car he drove, the watch on his wristlet was all blood money. Not metaphorically. Literally. It was the product of a man's stolen mind, his stolen life. He tried to swallow, but his throat was full of dust and ash. Elizabeth knew she was Ava now. She had to be avstood by the head of the table. She hadn't moved. Her posture was perfect. Her expression was not one of triumph or anger or even satisfaction. It was the calm, detached expression of a scientist observing the results of a long and painful experiment. The experiment was over. The hypothesis was proven. She let the silence stretch, let it press down on them. Let the full, crushing weight of their legacy settle into their bones. She watched Jacob's eyes flicker, saw the moment the denial shattered and the awful comprehension took its place. She saw Chloe's shoulders shake with sobs that made no sound. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the thick air like a shard of glass. You wanted to know the foundation of this company, she said, her gaze sweeping over Jacob and Chloe, their shell-shocked lawyers, and landing on Marcus Thorne, who sat stiffly, his face a mask of professional neutrality that couldn't quite hide the horror in his eyes. There it is. The original intellectual property. The ghost in the machine. Your father and I made a deal, a long time ago. He was the face. I was the brain. But he went further than I ever imagined. He didn't just want to win. He wanted to own. He wanted to possess. He took a brilliant mind and turned it into a battery. She took a slow, deliberate step towards the table. The sound of her heel on the marble floor was like a gavel strike. Your entire lives, she continued, her voice devoid of emotion. Your trust funds, your private schools, your homes, your sense of entitlement, all of it. It was all predicated on this, on the enslavement of a human being. Jacob's head snapped up. His eyes were wild. No, he rasped, the word cracking. My father! He wouldn't! He couldn't! He did, Ava said flatly. You saw the proof. You saw the financial records moving my money to a shell corporation that funded that facility for 40 years. You saw him. You think a video like that can be faked? We can have it authenticated. We can have doctors examine him. But you already know it's real. You can feel it, can't you, Jacob? The lie you've been living. Chloe lifted her head from the wastebasket. Her face was a mess of tears and bile. You knew! She shrieked, her voice raw. You knew all this time? You lived in our house, you ate at our table, and you knew he was down there? You're the monster! You let it happen! It was the last gasp of the Chloe. They all knew the attacker, the accuser. Ava simply looked at her. For the first time, a flicker of something cold and hard entered her eyes. I was a partner to a thief, Chloe. I will live with that. Your father was the one who built the prison. I discovered the extent of his depravity far too late. And by then, I was already in a prison of my own, wasn't I? The one you and your brother so happily helped him build for me. The quiet, simple-minded little wife. The servant. The ghost in her own home. She let that hang in the air. She walked slowly around the table until she stood directly behind Chloe, who flinched as if she'd been struck. But we are not here to debate the morality of the past, Ava said, her voice dropping to an almost conversational tone, which was somehow more terrifying. We are here to determine the future. Your futures, specifically. She looked at Jacob. You will walk away from here today. You will take nothing with you that you did not have on your person when you walked in. You will renounce, publicly and legally, any and all claim to the Davenport name, the Davenport estate, and the Davenport fortune. Jacob stared at her, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish pulled from the water. You will disappear, Ava stated, as if dictating terms of surrender. It was exactly what it was. You will move. You will change your names. You will become ghosts, just as Alistair Finch was forced to become one. You will not contact me. You will not contact Leo. You will not speak of this to anyone, ever. Not a reporter, not a friend, not a therapist. She paused, letting the totality of the sentence sink in. The complete erasure of their existence. Because, if you do, she said, her voice now a blade of ice, if I hear so much as a whisper, that video feed goes live. The decades of financial records, the shell corporations, the payments, the medical charts, all of it goes to every major news network on the planet. I will burn down the name of Davenport, and I will make sure you are standing in the center of the fire when I do. The world will know that your grandfather was a monster, and that you were the pampered beneficiaries of his crimes. Your lives, as you know them, will be over. You will be pariahs. You will be nothing. She didn't need to say more. The threat was absolute. It was not a possibility. It was a promise. Chloe began to weep again. Low, hopeless sobs of utter defeat. Jacob just sat there, broken. The fight was gone. The arrogance, the pride, the condescension, it had all been incinerated in the light of that terrible video. All that was left was a hollow man, as if on cue. A phone buzzed on the table. It was Leo's. All. He had left it there. Ava glanced down at the screen. It was a news alert notification from the Bellevue Police Department's public information feed. Asterisk. For immediate release, Bellevue PD. reopens 1986 cold case. The disappearance of noted AI researcher Dr. Alistair Finch, 45, is now an active investigation, citing credible new evidence received from an anonymous source. Asterisk. Ava looked from the phone to Jacob. She didn't smile. She didn't have to. The gears were already in motion. The world was already changing. The reckoning had begun. Their lawyers were silent, staring at their hands, at the useless documents in front of them. What could they say? Their case, built on influence and public perception, had been annihilated by a truth more horrific than any legal argument could counter. Marcus, Ava said, her voice now calm and businesslike. Please escort them out. Have them sign the renunciations. Then, begin the liquidation. She turned and walked towards the door, her back straight, her steps even. She didn't look back. She didn't need to see them crumble. She had already moved on. The past was a room she was now sealing shut forever. The 6 months that followed were a whirlwind of controlled demolition. Ava Hayes had reclaimed her name the day after the confrontation. The legal filings, a quiet but seismic event, dismantled the empire of Davenport Innovations with a brutal surgical efficiency. There were no press conferences, no dramatic announcements. It simply ceased to exist. Assets were sold off in carefully managed private transactions. Patents were licensed or sold to ethical tech firms. The towering glass headquarters in Bellevue was sold to a biotech consortium. The name Davenport was systematically scrubbed from the world of commerce. It was an erasure, just as she had promised Jacob and Chloe. With the colossal fortune that was now hers, unequivocally and entirely, she established the Finch Foundation. Its mission was simple and stark: to find, fund, and legally support the forgotten victims of intellectual property theft and academic abuse. It was an army of lawyers and researchers dedicated to fighting the ghosts of other Richard Davenports, to giving a voice to other silent was. Dr. Finch himself was her first, and most important, priority. He was moved from his sterile prison to a world-class private hospice nestled in the San Juan Islands, a place of quiet beauty and profound peace. Ava visited him once. He didn't know who she was. His mind was gone, shattered by decades of forced processing. But he seemed calm. He would sit in a garden overlooking the water, a faint, placid smile on his face. The nurses said he seemed to enjoy the warmth of the sun. He passed away a month after his arrival, peacefully. In his sleep, Ava arranged for his burial under his own name, in a quiet cemetery, his gravestone bearing a simple epitaph. A brilliant mind at rest. The Bellevue estate, that cold monument to a toxic legacy, was the last to go. Its contents were liquidated. The ostentatious furniture and art sold at auction. The proceeds funneled into the foundation. The house itself was bought by a developer who planned to tear it down and build something new. Ava didn't care. It was just a building. It held no power over her anymore. And then there was quiet. The new world was a house on the Oregon coast. It wasn't a mansion, it was a home. Made of cedar and glass, it was modern but modest, designed to blend with the windswept landscape of dunes and seagrass rather than dominate it. It was a place for watching storms roll in over the Pacific. A place where the loudest sound was the crashing of the waves. This is where she and Leo lived. They were walking on the beach, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the wet sand. The air was cool, smelling of salt and damp earth. Leo, now 20, had a new quietness about him. The frantic, tech-obsessed energy had been replaced by a thoughtful calm. He was no longer her accomplice, he was her student. But she wasn't teaching him code or market analysis. She was teaching him ethics, resilience, the difficult art of building a life on a foundation of truth. no matter how difficult that truth might be. Do you ever think about them? Leo asked, his eyes on the horizon. Ava didn't need to ask who they were. She knew. I think about the choices they made, she said, her voice carried by the wind. I think about the people they could have been, if they hadn't been so poisoned by what they thought they were owed. Do you hate them? Ava considered this for a long moment, watching a sandpiper dart along the water's edge. No, she said, and she was surprised to find it was true. Hate is a fire. It keeps you warm for a little while, but eventually it burns you down to the foundations. I spent too many years living in the smoke of someone else's fire. I'm done with it. She looked at him, at the young man who had seen the truth and chosen the difficult path. He had lost a family, a fortune, an entire identity. But he had gained himself. What your mother and uncle did, what your grandfather did, that is their story, not yours. You have the chance to write a different one. He nodded, understanding. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythm of their steps matching the rhythm of the tide pulling in and out. It was peaceful. A kind of peace Ava hadn't known was possible. It wasn't just the absence of fear. It was the presence of a quiet, solid strength. It was the feeling of being home in her own skin. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her jacket. It was a sound that felt alien in this place. She pulled it out. An unknown number. A single text message. Her breath caught for a fraction of a second. She knew, somehow, who it was from. She opened it. The message contained only 2 words. I'm sorry, Jacob. She stared at the screen, at the simple black letters against the white background. 6 months ago, those words might have meant something. They might have sparked anger or a bitter sense of vindication. Now, they were just words. An echo from a world that no longer existed. An apology from a ghost. It meant nothing. He wasn't apologizing to her, not really. He was apologizing to himself for the life he had lost. Her face betrayed no emotion. She held her thumb over the screen for a moment, then pressed delete. The message vanished. The screen was blank again. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and turned her face to the sea. The wind caught her silver hair, whipping it around her face. She closed her eyes, breathing in the vast, clean air. And then, for the first Timino, the tight, controlled smile of Elizabeth the wife, not the grim, determined smile of Ava the Avenger, but a true smilet graced her lips. It was small and gentle and peaceful. It was the smile of a woman who had walked through hell and found not just survival on the other side, but freedom. The camera of the world seemed to pull back, leaving her there on the shore with Leo, a small figure against the immense backdrop of the ocean and the sky. She was no longer a prisoner, no longer a ghost. She was the master of her own reclaimed world, watching the waves roll in, endless and new.